Greetings. Today we're going to be talking about examining ethics in nursing research in Chapter 4 of your textbook. Ethical research is essential for generating credible and trustworthy knowledge for evidence-based practice, so it's important that you understand what this is comprised of. This section of material is intended to provide you with the background for examining ethical aspects of studies. We'll discuss ethical codes and regulations that currently guide the conduct of biomedical and behavioral research. The understanding of the ethical conduct of research developed, unfortunately, as the scientific community and the public were confronted with examples of unethical studies. Unethical studies that violate subjects' rights have been implemented in the United States since biomedical research began. As these studies came to light, national codes and regulations were developed to promote the ethical conduct in research. These codes and regulations dramatically reduced the number of unethical studies, but unfortunately, ethical violations and research misconduct persist today, though I would say in not such a extensive manner. As a BSN prepared nurse, you'll need to be able to critically appraise the ethical aspects of published studies and of research conducted in clinical agencies. The methods sections of most published studies includes information about the ethical selection of study participants and their treatment during data collection. IRBs in universities and clinical agencies have been organized to examine the ethical aspects of studies before they are conducted. And you may have the opportunity to be a member of an IRB and to participate in the review of research for conduct once you get into the clinical agencies. I know you guys worked with the IRB here at LCSE last semester. The objectives of this chapter content are described in this slide and include identifying historical events which have influenced development of ethical codes and regulations. Page 91 of your textbook begins with discussion about Nazi medical experiments, the Tuskegee syphilis study, the Willowbrook study, and the Jewish chronic disease hospital study. I do highly encourage you to take the time to read these accounts of historical events because although they're appalling and obvious violations of ethical conduct, there really is a slippery slope between right and wrong. And those are the kinds of things we can talk about in the discussion board for this content. We intentionally ask you to investigate and discuss these topics to gain a deeper understanding of the rationale behind the studies that I mentioned above and the ease with which science, in quotations, can be used in defense of information gathering. Having a clear understanding of important ethical principles, human rights, and the role of an IRB will hopefully give you tools to evaluate future information and, when necessary, speak up to ensure the protection of human rights. So as I talked about, out of the history of unethical research has emerged both international and US standards and laws that delineate ethical research involving human subjects. The first was developed in the aftermath of World War II with the Nazi war experiments. Ethical research protects subjects and it should be carried out using scientific principles. Unethical research includes some minor and major things as outlined on this slide, like plagiarism, putting subjects at risk without consent, scientific misconduct, fraud, and research protocol violations, fabrication, falsification, and forging of data. I think it's really important to remember that these things don't need to be done intentionally to break the law. Additionally, there's examples out there where informed consent wasn't obtained because it was just like an intervention added to nursing care in the hospital, but it was gathered as evidence, and so it is a violation of these ethical principles. So just keeping in mind how careful you need to be when carrying out research. Elements of ethical research are protecting human rights, understanding informed consent, understanding institutional review of research, and balancing benefits and risks in a study. The history of ethical codes and regulations were first articulated following the Nuremberg tribunals of German war crimes. And those were the Nazi experiments that were brought to trial before the Nuremberg tribunals, and their unethical research received international attention. In 1949, after the trial ended, the Nuremberg Code was released, and the code includes guidelines that employs the elements from the previous slide regarding ethical research. Box 4.1 presents the key tenets of the Nuremberg Code in your textbook. This code outlines the rationale for study. Research should only be conducted when necessary knowledge can't be gained any other way. Research should be based on the results of previous studies, including what we've learned from animal experimentation and knowledge of natural history of disease. Research should be designed to yield results that are needed by society, not just for gaining information, right? And then research should be that the anticipated results would justify conducting this study. The topics that we give you to discuss really are examples that violate this code. The Nuremberg Code outlines the rights of human subjects to consent voluntarily and does allow them to withdraw at any time without penalty. Again, one of the issues that was not addressed in the examples that we'll talk about. The code also outlines risk avoidance, which calls for no unnecessary physical or mental suffering and injury, and that a study can be terminated if the risk of harm increases. Finally, the code states that there should be adequate resources to protect subjects. Listed on the slide are the different examples of the regulations as they were written. The Nuremberg Code provided the basis for the development of the Declaration of Helsinki, which was adopted in 1964. And a major focus of the declaration was clarifying the difference between therapeutic research and non-therapeutic research. Therapeutic research provides patients with an opportunity to receive an experimental treatment that might have beneficial results. Non-therapeutic research is conducted to generate knowledge for science. The results may help future patients, but are not expected to benefit those acting as research participants. Researchers are responsible for protecting the health, privacy, and dignity of human subjects, and for selecting important study topics concerning the risks and burdens for subjects. In the United States, the first major ethical guide was the Belmont Report that was written by the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects of Biomedical and Behavioral Research. That is a mouthful. The commission was formed in response to the public outcry when the Tuskegee syphilis study was exposed. The Belmont Report identified ethical principles to guide selecting subjects, informing them of the risks and benefits of a study, and documenting their consent. This report also detailed differences between therapeutic and non-therapeutic research and the application of research findings in the practice of medicine. Let's see, the ethical principles addressed in the National Commission for the Protection of Human Subjects guidelines includes respect for persons, the principles of beneficence, and the principle of justice. So you'll remember from J2 semester in your PRD course, beneficence is doing good, and justice is equal treatment for all. There's a picture on this slide of kind of breaking down those principles into what they look like, and we'll also talk about them in the next few slides. And the report is available in the link here on the slide. So we're going to talk about the ethical principles addressed on a deeper level in the next few slides. So how do you define respect for persons? The principle of respect for person indicates that people should be treated as autonomous agents. with the right to choose whether or not to participate in research and to withdraw from a study. This principle is linked to autonomy. So people have a right to full and honest disclosure, the ability to provide voluntary consent, and for information to remain confidential. Those with diminished autonomy, such as children, people who are terminally or mentally ill, and prisoners, are entitled to additional protection. Subjects from vulnerable populations may also need safeguards enacted to ensure the principle of respect of persons is protected. The principle of beneficence encourages the researcher to do good and, above all, do no harm. This principle is the foundation for analyzing the benefits and risks of a specific study. Researchers guided by this principle seek to reduce the risks and ensure that the subjects receive the benefits. A specific example is an intervention study in which enhanced diabetic education improves glucose control in the treatment group. At the end of the study, a researcher guided by beneficence would provide the intervention for the subjects in the control group, right? If you know it's beneficial, you would give it to all involved. Beneficence also involves maintaining the integrity of the study and disseminating the findings so that the maximum scientific benefit can be gained from the study. Findings of poorly designed and implemented studies have no benefit to the subjects and the wider population, so shouldn't be done. The principle of justice states that human subjects have a right to fair treatment, which includes access to the potential benefits of a study and not overexposure to its risks. Justice leads to fairness. Maintaining justice in research means that inclusion and exclusion criteria, as outlined in Chapter 9, for the subjects in studies must have scientific and/or logical explanations. This slide talks about the different components of the protection of human subject regulation, in that additional protection for the vulnerable population. So for pregnant women, human fetuses, neonates, children, and prisoners are considered, and then ensures that there's documentation of this consent and that the IRB process has actually been implemented. The U.S. Food and Drug Administration also has protections regarding clinical investigations with human subjects involving products. This also goes to animal studies, and then clinical trials for drug investigations must also comply with FDA regulations. Do you recognize HIPAA? So the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act was implemented in 2003 to protect individuals' private health information. As you know, these rules are very strict, and research needs to be conducted according to rules as outlined by HIPAA as well. This does affect research studies by requiring patient consent to use private health information, and many times by removing that information if that's a reasonable request.